Welcome to the Last Transmission podcast, the signal that breaks through deception. In 1999, the FBI released a document called the Megiddo Project, a chilling analysis of religious extremism, New World Order fears, and the rising threat of apocalyptic violence at the turn of the millennium. But here's the question: were they just looking back, or were they warning us about the future we're now living in? In this episode, we uncover how prophecy, conspiracy, and spiritual war collided in the FBI's own words, and why this report may be more relevant in 2025 than it was in 2000. Stay tuned. This transmission runs deeper than you think.
All right. Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive here on the Last Transmission podcast.
Absolutely. Always exciting to dive into these topics, to kind of dig in and see what we can unearth.
Yeah, kind of sifting through the noise, trying to get to the truth.
Absolutely.
And, especially with the name of this podcast, The Last Transmission, we always want to be looking ahead.
Yeah.
And, sometimes looking ahead means looking back. Right. Looking back at what's happened.
Right. Seeing what signals, what echoes we can hear from history.
Exactly.
That might tell us something about what might be coming.
Exactly. So today, we are looking at the Megiddo Project.
Okay, now this is a big one.
It is a big one.
This isn't just some, internet forum or something. This was an actual strategic assessment undertaken by the FBI back in 1999.
Yeah. So this is, a government document, and for those of you listening who are Christians, like, why should this matter to you? Why should we care about this today? Right.
So the Megiddo Project, it's specifically focused on the potential for domestic extremism right at the cusp, of the new millennium.
At the turn of the century.
Yeah, exactly. And specifically, they were looking at groups that were religiously motivated, anticipating the apocalypse.
Okay.
And then also those who were, subscribers, adherents to the New World Order conspiracy theory.
Okay, the NWO.
The NWO, that's right. So by kind of delving into what they were worried about back then, we can maybe glean some insights on whether any of those currents, those concerns, are still relevant today.
Still around.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've got some sources for this deep dive.
Okay.
One is from the PBS Frontline website, which kind of covered the project when it was news.
Right.
Back in the day. And then we also have the actual FBI's Project Megiddo document.
Wow.
So we're getting this right from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, straight from the source.
So I think we got to start with the name, right? Megiddo?
Yeah, I mean, that's attention-grabbing right off the bat. It sounds ominous.
It does. So what's the story there? What is Megiddo?
So Megiddo itself is actually a hill.
Okay.
It's in northern Israel.
Right.
And it's a place that's been strategically important for over 4,000 years. I mean, so many different cities were built and rebuilt there because it controlled this really important mountain pass on the plain of Jezreel.
Wow.
So, I mean, whoever had Megiddo basically controlled a key choke point. It was really important.
Wow. So this location has seen a lot of action.
Oh, tons. I mean, countless battles have been fought there for millennia. And, that's where we get the word Armageddon.
Okay.
It's from the Hebrew meaning hill of Megiddo. But over time, in English, Armageddon has come to mean any kind of just huge, decisive battle.
It's a big one.
The final showdown. Exactly.
So I'm guessing this is where the book of Revelation comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, talks about Armageddon as the central gathering point for this huge apocalyptic battle, right? God versus evil.
Right.
So the FBI, when they chose this name, they weren't being casual about it.
Yeah.
The report actually says it's an apt title for a project looking at people who thought the year 2000 was going to bring about the end times and maybe even try to make it happen through violence.
Wow.
So right there in the name, you've got this sense of potential violence, linked to end times beliefs.
Okay, so we see where the name comes from. We see the biblical connection to, potential end times, potential for violence.
Yeah.
So what exactly were these people that the FBI was looking at so worried about? What were their major concerns?
So the Megiddo Project really zeroes in on two main drivers of this millennial extremism.
Okay.
So number one, you've got religious beliefs that are really focused on the apocalypse.
Okay.
And then number two, you've got political beliefs, specifically those tied into this New World Order conspiracy theory.
Okay, so kind of a religious angle and a political angle.
Exactly. And the FBI basically thought these two things could push people to do extreme stuff as we got closer to the year 2000.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. First, let's talk about the religious beliefs that were causing concern back then. What were some of the specific apocalyptic beliefs that they were worried about?
Well, Project Megiddo found that a lot of these extremists, they were putting so much weight on the new millennium, like it was going to be this massive turning point.
Yeah.
And it was all based on how they interpreted the book of Revelation.
Okay.
And a lot of these right-wing religious extremists, they were convinced that the U.S. government was basically Satan's puppet.
Wow.
And they thought the millennium would kick off this final showdown between, Christian martyrs and this evil government. And they thought it might all start in 2000. It was all very much tied to the imagery and prophecies of Revelation.
So it wasn't just about waiting for the end to happen. It was about potentially, making it happen.
That's the unsettling part, right? Some of these folks weren't just passive. They seemed like they wanted to light the fuse, so to speak.
So what were some of the specific groups or ideologies that they were keeping tabs on?
Well, a big one was Christian identity. These guys believe that the white Aryan race is God's chosen people. And they think Jews are descended from Satan.
Wow.
And they believe Armageddon is going to be this race war. So a lot of them were prepping for this, stockpiling supplies, doing paramilitary training, setting up these isolated compounds. And what's really scary is that they didn't have a clear leadership structure.
Okay.
So the FBI was really concerned about lone wolves or small groups, just deciding to act on their own without anyone to answer to.
So not just a large organized group.
Right. Much harder to track and predict.
Okay, scary stuff. Any other groups that were kind of on their radar?
Yeah, they were also watching apocalyptic cults really closely. These groups were convinced that the millennium would bring about this huge shift in the world, right?
Yeah.
And they thought a battle against Satan would start right around then.
And I'm guessing they saw the government as, working for Satan in this scenario?
Oh, absolutely. The government was like Satan's earthly representative.
Right.
And the report talks about how these cultic relationships work, where followers become completely dependent on a leader who claims to have some kind of special knowledge or a divine mission.
Right.
And they listed all these factors that could increase the chance of violence within these cults.
Oh, like what?
Well, things like being isolated from the outside world, having a leader who's, maybe a psychopath or a narcissist, or if the leader suddenly changes their behavior or their message, or if they start using violent language or giving orders for violence.
Yeah, or if they've been able to get away with their stuff for a long time without anyone stopping them. And of course, who the leader's closest allies are also matters.
Right, their inner circle.
Yeah, all of that plays into it.
Yeah, all of that feeds into whether these groups might turn violent.
Okay, so it sounds like there are lots of red flags to look out for.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about whether they thought the end was coming. It was about how they thought it would play out.
Okay, so there was a difference there.
Yeah. Some cults felt like it was their job to actually speed up the end times.
Okay.
Maybe through violent acts. But others were more focused on surviving it.
Okay, so kind of two different approaches, but both potentially dangerous.
Exactly. And their report specifically calls out the Concerned Christians cult.
Okay.
They had some really specific beliefs about Jerusalem in December of '99.
Okay, we'll come back to that later. It shows you how global these anxieties were. But first, I want to understand, how did these groups interpret the Bible, especially Revelation, to justify their beliefs and their timelines?
Well, they took a lot of it very literally.
Okay.
Super literally. And they used the symbolism and the numbers in Revelation to back up their ideas about when and how the apocalypse would unfold. So, for example, the number 4, they saw that as representing the earth. 6 was like imperfection, the mark of man. 7 was completeness, divine perfection. 12 was the tribes of Israel, or the apostles. And 1,000 represented this huge stretch of time.
Wow.
And then colors were important too. White was power, victory. Red was war and bloodshed. Black was famine and suffering. And a pale green horse meant death.
Wow, so almost like they were creating their own code based on the Bible.
That's a good way to put it. And then they'd reinterpret things to fit their worldview, like Babylon in Revelation, which is usually understood as the Roman Empire, right? They would say it represented the U.S. government, which they saw as just as corrupt and evil.
Interesting. So they were twisting scripture to fit their narrative.
Yeah, in a way. And the report talks about other groups, too, like the Black Hebrew Israelites.
Okay.
They use the number 144,000 from Revelation, the number of those who were saved.
Right.
To support their own beliefs and their identity. And then you've got the Phineas priests. They were part of the Christian identity movement, and they used a passage from the Book of Numbers to justify violence against people they thought were breaking God's laws.
Like what?
Well, things like interracial relationships,
Okay.
stuff like that. And the report talks about guys like Gordon Call and Bob Matthews,
Okay.
who basically had this death wish, this martyr complex. They were ready to die for their beliefs in these confrontations with law enforcement. It just shows you how intense and how dangerous these beliefs could be.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so we've talked about the religious side of things. Now, what about this New World Order conspiracy theory? What was that all about?
So the FBI was also really worried about this whole New World Order idea, or NWO for short, especially within the militia movement. Basically, they were terrified that the UN was going to use the Y2K bug, all that chaos with computers,
Right.
to stage a military coup and set up a socialist one-world government. And they thought this would all go down in the year 2000.
The UN was like the big bad wolf in this scenario.
Right. They saw them as this shadowy global power just waiting to take over.
And that's a narrative that hasn't really gone away.
No, it's still around for sure.
So what exactly did they think this NWO would look like? What were they so scared of?
Well, they thought the UN would abolish private property, take away everyone's guns.
Right.
They thought elections would be meaningless. The UN Charter would replace the Constitution.
Wow.
The UN would control religion and education. And, get this, they thought the government would turn federal facilities into concentration camps.
For who?
For patriots,
Whoa.
for anyone who resisted the NWO. And they had this whole list of villains, the usual suspects, Jewish people, communists, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, all these shadowy figures pulling the strings.
And they thought Y2K was going to be the perfect opportunity for this to happen?
Oh, yeah. They thought all the computer problems would cause this massive meltdown. Power outages, economic collapse, riots. They thought the UN would swoop in, pretending to be peacekeepers, and then, bam, take over.
So they were worried about losing their freedom, their country.
Absolutely. They were convinced it was all part of this big plan to enslave them. And the report mentions people like James Wickstrom and Norm Olson, who were really pushing these ideas, spreading the fear. And even William Pierce, who was the head of the National Alliance, he didn't think Y2K would be that bad, but he still thought all these extremists would freak out and cause a lot of trouble. And then, on top of all that, they pointed to gun control laws like the Brady Bill and the assault weapons ban as proof that the government was trying to disarm people before the UN takeover.
Wow. They were really tying everything together.
Oh, yeah. It was all connected in their minds. And they often referenced the Turner Diaries, which is this really disturbing novel about a violent revolution and race war, as a vision of what the future under the NWO would be like.
It's amazing how these fears, the religious apocalypse and the political conspiracy, could all just blend together.
Yeah, they fed off each other, they reinforced each other. And as we got closer to 2000, the FBI was really worried that these things would come to a head.
Yeah.
That people would start acting out either to bring about the end times or to fight against this supposed New World Order.
So it was a very volatile time.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about Jerusalem. You mentioned it earlier. The report really hones in on Jerusalem as a potential powder keg.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why was Jerusalem such a focal point for all this millennial anxiety?
Well, Jerusalem is this incredibly important city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Yeah.
And Project Megiddo recognized that it could be a major flashpoint for violence.
Okay.
They saw that religious fervor was already running high in Israel as we approached 2000. In fact, the Israeli government even deported the concerned Christians cult because they were causing so much trouble. And the biggest concern was the Temple Mount. That's the spot where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are located.
Okay.
And it's also sacred to Jews because it's where the first and second temples stood. The Western Wall is right there, too.
So much history, so much religious significance, all packed into one place.
Exactly. It's already a tense place, and the Israeli authorities were worried that things could boil over with all this millennial hype.
Yeah.
Like even a small act of disrespect at one of the holy sites could spark a huge backlash. And to make things even more complicated, Ramadan was expected to fall right around the start of 2000.
Oh, wow.
So there was this real fear that even an innocent mistake could escalate into something really bad.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And then you had all these tourists and pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. Some of them were from these apocalyptic cults.
Okay.
They thought that by being there, they could, hasten the arrival of the Messiah.
Cool.
So you had all these people with all these different beliefs and motivations all converging on this one incredibly sensitive spot.
So the potential for conflict was huge.
It was. The authorities were worried that extremists, both Jewish and Muslim, would react violently to all these pilgrims.
Yeah.
And they were particularly concerned about these apocalyptic cults.
Okay.
Some of them believed that they needed to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Rock, to make way for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. They thought that was necessary for the Messiah to return.
So they were willing to use violence to bring about what they saw as God's plan.
That's right, and they even said that violence in Jerusalem could have global repercussions.
Right, because of all the different religious groups who care about that city.
Exactly. So this wasn't just a local issue. It was something that could have easily spilled over into other parts of the world.
Especially the U.S., I imagine.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We've got our own share of extremists from all these different religions.
Right, right. So this whole situation with Jerusalem, combined with everything else that was going on, it's no wonder that law enforcement was on edge.
Yeah, it's understandable they were facing a lot of potential threats.
So what were their main concerns? What did Project Megiddo say about the challenges facing law enforcement?
Well, the FBI's biggest concern was that the new millennium would make these extremists more likely to act out violently.
Okay.
And they were worried that they might even target law enforcement officers specifically.
Wow.
They thought that religious extremists might pick fights with law enforcement, thinking that it would help bring about Armageddon.
Right.
Or they might see cops as representing this evil government they were so afraid of.
Yeah. So in their eyes, law enforcement was either an obstacle or even part of the enemy.
Right. And they were also worried about the whole martyrdom thing.
Okay.
Like, these extremists might see dying in a confrontation with law enforcement as some kind of, heroic sacrifice.
Right.
Like it would fulfill their destiny or something. So it made things very unpredictable and dangerous for cops.
Yeah. It would be hard to know how to handle a situation like that.
Exactly. And the report even said that something as routine as a traffic stop could escalate really quickly.
Wow.
They were worried that even small interactions could turn violent.
So they were basically saying that law enforcement had to be extra careful and extra prepared for the unexpected.
Absolutely. And they needed to be aware of all these different ideologies and motivations that might be driving people to do extreme things.
Okay, so that was then. It's been over 20 years.
Right.
We're well past the year 2000. So what does all this mean for us today? For you listening, especially if you're a Christian, should we still be worried about these things?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, sure, the Y2K bug was a dud. We all survived. But have the ideologies and the fears that fueled all this extremism just disappeared? Or have they just morphed and adapted to the new world we live in?
Right. So maybe it's not about 2000 anymore. Maybe it's about some other event, some other trigger.
Exactly. Maybe the specific dates and targets have shifted, but the underlying narratives, the fears, are still very much alive.
So we might not be worried about Y2K anymore, but there might be something else that people are fixated on.
Right. And those deep-seated beliefs about a cosmic battle between good and evil, the distrust of government, the anxieties about global conspiracies, those things haven't gone away. They can easily find new targets, new ways to express themselves.
So how should we, as Christians, approach discussions about the end times, about potential threats, knowing all this? What can we learn from Project Megiddo?
I think the biggest takeaway is to be discerning.
Okay.
To not fall into the trap of extremism. We need to be aware of how easily these apocalyptic anxieties and conspiracy theories can be used to justify violence.
Right.
Understanding that history is crucial, it helps us navigate these conversations in a more balanced way without giving in to fear or being swept up in dangerous ideologies.
So it's about being informed, but not letting that information paralyze us with fear.
Exactly. It's about using our knowledge to ground ourselves in our faith and the values of love, hope, and reason, and not getting caught up in speculation or wild claims.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Megiddo Project, what are the key things you think we should all remember?
Well, first and foremost, the project showed us that the combination of religious apocalyptic beliefs and fears about the New World Order could be really dangerous.
Right.
And it highlighted how Jerusalem, with all its religious significance, could easily become a flashpoint for violence. And it warned law enforcement about the possibility of increased violence and even attacks on officers.
So it was a wake-up call about some very real threats.
Exactly. And our goal with this deep dive was to bring that awareness to you, our listeners, and to encourage you to think critically about these issues.
And to hopefully learn from the past so that we can make better decisions in the present.
Absolutely. It's all about being informed, being discerning, and not letting fear dictate our actions.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on, as we often like to do on the Last Transmission podcast. In light of everything we've talked about today, how can we, as Christians, balance a healthy sense of vigilance with the hope that is so central to our faith? What does it look like to be aware of potential dangers without letting fear take over or without twisting Scripture to fit our anxieties?
That's a really important question. I think it requires ongoing reflection, a deep understanding of the Bible, and a commitment to wisdom and discernment, especially in this world where there's so much information coming at us from all directions.
And if you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the sources we mentioned.
Yeah.
The PBS Frontline website has a lot of great information about the Megiddo Project. And if you can find it, the FBI's actual document is really worth a read.
I mean, it really is.
Doing your own research, thinking critically about what you find, those are the best tools for forming your own informed opinions.
Absolutely. And for not being swayed by fear or by extremism.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, stay vigilant and stay hopeful.
You've been listening to the Last Transmission podcast. The Megiddo Project wasn't just a snapshot of millennial paranoia. It was a prophetic warning, one that reveals how fragile the balance is between faith, fear, and fanaticism. In a world filled with digital noise and spiritual warfare, discernment is no longer optional. So stay grounded, stay informed, and never stop asking, who's really pulling the strings? Until next time, this is The Last Transmission.